turn it on. There. We're going to be in 2 Peter 2, 4 through 9. If you want to get your Bibles open there. I've entitled this 3 examples, and when we read the passage, it will be perfectly obvious why it got that title. So, find the clicker here. I've been a student of history for all of my life, basically. I've always been fascinated by it. One of the things about history is it is an excellent predictor of human behavior. If you look at a set of circumstances in the past that might be similar to the circumstances that we're in, then how people behaved in the past shows how people will likely behave in the future. It's never perfect, but it's a good predictor in the sense that it may be some variation of that. But what we did under these circumstances in the past is very likely what we're going to do right now. But this is also true with God. What I mean by that is if we look at circumstances and how God reacted in the past, and we find those circumstances today, we can predict how God will act in that set of circumstances as well. Wrong thing there. All right. So the purpose of this letter that Peter's writing, 2 Peter, is to resist the false teaching that is emerging in the church, Gnosticism. Gnosticism is a specific example of a general case, and that is basically do not add or take away from the Word of God. In this case, both of those are going on. They're adding something to the gospel that doesn't belong there, and they're gutting the core of the gospel by their denial that Jesus was the Christ, the Son of God, denying his death, burial, and resurrection, and his ascension to heaven. It basically blends Greek philosophy and Christianity. And that's the most common way that false doctrine enters in the general case is I have Christianity and I have this other thing over here that I like pretty well, so let's just kind of merge these two together because that makes me feel really good. Well, that's not the way this is supposed to work. So they're going through this in the first century, basically about 30 years after Christ left this earth. From last week's lesson, Peter's warning to them was, false teachers will arise among Christians just as surely as false prophets rose in Israel. If you're familiar with the Old Testament, there's a very rich history in the Old Testament about false prophets and when they arose, how they arose, what they taught, and what the outcome was when people followed after them. In most cases, false teaching is an act of will, not ignorance. Now, it can be an act of ignorance, somebody teaching something that's wrong because their knowledge is imperfect, but one of the ways we know, that it is really ignorance and not will is once this knowledge gap is corrected, they start to teach the right thing and practice the right thing. So, Apollos in Acts chapter 19 is a case of that in the New Testament because he was just teaching the baptism of John, and when he was taught more perfectly, he taught the gospel more perfectly. In the Old Testament, embracing false prophets and their message was devastating. Israel was destroyed because they embraced the message of false prophets. Judah was destroyed because they embraced the message of false prophets. The difference between the final outcome in both cases is God needed Judah for a promise that he made to Abraham, and he didn't need those other people, so they're never heard from again when they go into captivity. So the lesson to learn there is embracing false teaching will also be devastating. All right. Any questions or comments before we get into our reading? Who's my volunteer? Gordon?
For if God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness, to be reserved for judgment, and did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, one of 8 people, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood on the world of the ungodly, and turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them to destruction, making them an example of those who afterward live ungodly, and delivered righteous Lot, who was oppressed by the filthy conduct of the wicked. For that righteous man dwelling among them tormented his righteous soul from day to day by seeing and hearing their lawless deeds. Then the Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptations and to reserve the unjust under punishment for the day of judgment.
Unfortunately, the passage actually continues on, but we'll get into that next week. We don't have time to get it all, so this is what we're going to cover. So, the important words here. The first word I've highlighted for you is the word if. If is usually a thing that's a conditional statement. If, it might indicate the possibility that something may happen or it may not. In this particular case, it's not conditional. It's actually emphatic, which basically you could almost say is the word since. Since God did not spare the angels, that's important. You'll notice I've got funny coloring on all of the verbs in here. On the first page here, cast, preserved, and condemned. The reason it's colored funny is because we're not doing any of them. This is God doing all of the verbs and actions in here. The word example deserves a good eyeball. Rescued, that's the wrong one. Messed my slides up. Well, now you know the definitions. Okay. So, and tormented is also, especially in the sense that it applies to Lot. So, if is conditional, could be translated, is not conditional, it could be translated since. Hell is the Greek word Tartarus, and it means for them the abode of the wicked dead. It is the Greek equivalent to the Hebrew Gehenna, which is their word for hell. Basically, he's talking about the same thing in both cases. It's just Peter's using the Greek word for it, and this is the only place in the New Testament that the Greek word is actually used. And so this is most likely a clarification thing. He's talking to a predominantly Greek audience, so he'll use their word that translates to this. The abode of the wicked dead. In Tartarus, in the Greek mythologies, that's kind of the pit. They had the idea of the pit there, and this was the pit where you went and you were tormented in this. And some people equate in the story of the rich man and Lazarus, in that story, that where the rich man winds up is Tartarus, because that would have been a very Greek thing to do. Example is that which is shown, means literally to show under. And tormented is to torment or vex with grievous pain. So the importance of that is that word's not fooling around. I mean, this is some serious pain and agony. And if you've had your gallbladder go out on you, you know something about that. I mean, that was one of the craziest things that I ever had happen. I've never expected something that big could hit that hard. This is even worse here. So what God is doing, cast means to put in place or put in a place. Preserved is to guard or keep watch over. Condemned is to judge worthy of punishment. Rescued and rescued, to cause to escape, to deliver. Keep, to attend carefully, to take care of. So let's put it all together. Since God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them or put them in a place into hell or Tartarus and committed them to pits of darkness reserved for judgment, and did not spare the ancient world, but preserved, kept watch over Noah, a preacher of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly, and since he condemned, judged worthy of punishment the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to destruction by reducing them to ashes, having made them an example to those who would live ungodly thereafter. And if or since he rescued righteous Lot, oppressed by the sensual conduct of unprincipled men, for by what he saw and heard, that righteous man, while living among them, felt that his righteous soul tormented day after day with their lawless deeds, then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from temptation and to keep the unrighteous under punishment for the day of judgment. So, where are we going with this? Peter provides 3 examples that support his thesis. Following false teachers and their message will lead to destruction. This is a thing that I had never really considered before, but Peter, by giving us 3 examples, may be telling us something important. When a Hebrew or Jewish writer says something 3 times, that means, anybody remember? Pay attention to this. This is important. Pay attention to it. And so these examples illustrate, I think, different aspects of God's work in judgment, but they all have a common theme. So if we look at the first example of fallen angels, the full story of the fallen angels is not fully discussed in the Bible. This is always something that when we read it, even in this passage, or see some things in other passages that kind of imply that this is going on or this happened, we don't have all the information in the Bible about this. This is probably the best description of what happened in the whole Bible. So, why is there not more? I don't know. This is enough. I don't think this should stress us out or cause us to go down a rabbit hole. We have enough information here to understand what's happening. So, what can we know, or what can we deduce? These angels were in the presence of God, but chose to sin or rebel. Why did they do that? Somebody wake up one morning and decide, I'm really grouchy today, I think I'll sin and rebel. Heard something that led them, they heard a message that led them away from God. What was it? I don't know. But it cost them dearly to pay heed to that message. And so now, in the first example, where do we find these guys at? Verse 5, and did not spare the ancient. No, that's not the one, is it? Verse 4, yes. He cast them into hell and committed them to the darkness reserved for judgment. So it's not done judging them yet, but because of the message that they heard and they heeded, which was not God's message, because that's not why God created them, they wound up in this particular condition. Any questions or comments on that? How about the second example? Story of Noah is found in Genesis chapter 6 through chapter 9. In Genesis chapter 6 and verse 1, we find that the world had become increasingly wicked. If we read down in verse 9, we read that God was sorry. In the Hebrew, you could also translate that repented. Repented is not something that happens to us. It's a decision that we make. When we're talking about repenting in the New Testament, we're nearly always talking about repenting from sin, which is basically a change of heart leads to a change of action. Well, here's a case where God repented, and it grieved him, it pained and hurt him that he had made man. So, how would you feel if you gave birth to a child, and as this child grew up, this thing was just pure evil? Now, there are times when you look at your children, we looked at our children, we kind of wondered, did we get here yet? Is this child ever going to straighten up their behavior or what have you and things like that? But not in this particular sense, the way that God has felt about this particular situation. But one man, Noah, and his family stood out from the others, and God chose to save them. Except, a little bit different situation here. Noah had to act to save himself, didn't he? What was he told to do?
Build the ark.
Build the ark. He's told how to build it, size, dimensions, materials, how to seal it in, seal it out, keep the water out because it's going to be out, floating in this water for hundreds of days for an event basically that he has no way to understand what the event really is. I mean, flood the whole world, cover it all with water, all of this rain. He has nothing to judge that by. He just has to trust the message that he's given there. And so this action took, I believe, decades for him to be able to do this. And part of the thing that this would have provided time for everyone else to repent. I mean, if you're walking by Noah's place and you see the scaffolding, the keel being laid on this big wooden boat, these guys are working on this thing, day after day after day, and you ask them, what are you doing? Flood's coming, world's going to be cleansed, we're going to get on this ark and we're going to survive. They don't believe it either. So they didn't repent, so judgment came, but God never lost track of Noah and his family. Again, why did the ancient world go down this path? What message did they hear?
Same message the angels heard.
Yeah, basically, I got something better than what God's got for you. Noah heard a message. This is going to happen, and this is what you need to do to save yourself. And so that's what he did. Now, did he do it all by himself? No, he did not. God was active at this particular point. And God even closed the door when it came time for them to get in there. I guess it was a big old heavy door. Got everything loaded in there, food, animals, and stuff like that. God closed the door and made sure that the ship survived. So, but God never lost track of Noah and his family. I don't know how many millions of people there were on the earth at that particular time. There's roughly 8 billion people on the earth today. And so if we took a little piece of paper and wrote everybody's name on it and put it in something big enough to hold 8 billion of those little pieces of paper and stirred it up really good, what are the odds they would draw your name or my name? 1 in 8 billion. 1 in 8 billion. You know what's kind of funny though? If you drew a name, somebody hit. Somebody hit. But God didn't lose, however many millions of people out there, God did not lose track of Noah because he followed the message. Any thoughts or comments?
And how lucky was he that they chose his whole family?
Yeah. Honestly, I think that's part of the reason he was chosen there, because at least he had delivered spiritual leadership or something to these people to make sure that they were following God too. So I don't think that was an accident. All right, third story. This story is found in Genesis chapter 13, predominantly in chapter 19. There's some other stuff that goes in between these particular chapters. So I'll give you the synopsis. Lot was Abraham's nephew. He was the son of Abraham's brother, Haran, I think it was. We find that in Genesis 11:27. And so when God tells Abram, go forth to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and all of these things that he says at the beginning of chapter 12, when Abraham leaves Haran to go where God is going to show him, Lot went with him. So in chapter 13, there's a problem. Abraham had large flocks and Lot had large flocks, and so as their various shepherds are out grazing their flocks everywhere, there wasn't enough grass to support both flocks, and so they started fighting. Lot's herdsman versus Abram's herdsman. And Abram says, this is not right. We're brothers, so let's not fight. You pick a direction, you go that direction, and I'll go another direction. And so Lot looked down at the side of Sodom and Gomorrah, and he said, a lot of water there. They're cities. I like cities maybe, or I like being around people and things like that. I'll go that direction, and Abraham goes another direction. And so then we have God telling Abram, Sarah, Isaac's going to be born, and then he tells Abram, he says, shall I hide from Abram the thing I'm about to do? And he decides not to, so he tells him, I'm going to go down at Sodom and Gomorrah because the news of their sin is great, and I want to go down and see for myself how bad it really is. And Abram argues or discusses this with God. He says, if there's 50 righteous, will you spare the city? Gets him all the way down to 10. And God says, if there's 10 righteous people in the cities, I'll spare them. And then God goes in there, and there's not 10. But even at that point, he says, Lot's here. I got to get Lot out of the city. And so that's what happens in chapter 19. Peter says that Lot is grieved by the behavior of his neighbors, but if he was, why did he never leave the city? Well, we can do that. That's kind of inconsistent with people. It's like, I don't want to, living in this place is really awful because these people aren't believers in God, they're not followers, but I kind of like it here. It's well-watered cities, nightlife, if you're into that sort of a thing, kind of a nice place to live, but I really wish the residents would, clean up their act with God and get this better. And in fact, when the angels come in and tell Lot, you got to get out of the city, they're not moving. They don't move to get out of the city, and so they're trying to push him on, and he finally says, well, how about if we could just go to this place? It's a little place, and it's far enough away that we should be out of the blast. And God, fine, do that. And even at that, his wife doesn't make it because she looks back. They told them, don't look back. She looks back. So really, Lot entered the city with great wealth, and he left with nothing but his life and 2 daughters. That's it. Went in with all of this. This is what he came out with. So, in this passage, all of the actions are performed by God. However, God's action was based on the decisions and actions of the beings in the 3 examples. In the first examples, some angels made a decision that we're not going to follow God. We've got this other message that for some reason has an appeal to them. And even though they were in the presence of God, they wanted something else. And so that got them put to where they were, awaiting final judgment in this situation. The people in the days of Noah did not heed the message. If Noah preached to them, which Christ has told, he's already told us, Christ went back and talked to them. We believe that he may have gone back in spirit to this time to preach to these people. They didn't heed any message there as well. Lot, bugged by, he's kind of an enigma, isn't he? Living in this situation where he was bothered by the lives of the people and the sins that they were committing, but he didn't leave. And sometimes it's a little bit hard to let go of things like this, but he didn't leave. But he was still preserved there. So those who rejected God were cast into a place and condemned. Those who followed God were preserved, rescued, and kept. So in the days of Noah, 8 people protected. In the days of Lot, in that situation, 3 people saved from that destruction. Noah heard the message of God and followed it. Nobody else did. That's where they wound up at. Lot heard the message of God, followed it reluctantly perhaps, but they got out with their lives in here. And all of this is God's work. The casting and condemning was God's work. The preserving, the rescuing, and the keeping was God's work and his effort in this situation. So, in all 3 examples, we see beings who chose to heed a different message than God's message. Remember what he talked about in the first 3 verses? False teachers and things like that. The false message that they're bringing. The message is false. The false prophets had a false message. The false teachers are having a false message. And there are consequences for embracing this thing. Sometimes we don't believe things that we're told, like don't stick wires in the outlet and grab the handles on it like this. If you want to get a shock, do that. If you let it go through your heart, it'll probably kill you. So don't do that. You don't let your children play around with the electrical outlet because they're not smart enough to know that this thing can knock them across the room. So we put those plugs in there, and then we watch when they learn to figure out how to get them out of there, and we have to come up with another system. But we're always, trying to keep them out of harm's way. When they don't believe it, they pay a consequence. Watched a granddaughter several weeks ago, looking at the stove. We had an electric stove, had the hot burner light on, things like that, and she was looking at that thing, and Jack started to say, don't. She reached out and touched it. It didn't hurt her really. It didn't permanently disfigure her or anything like that, but she learned what I think was a very valuable lesson. We don't tell you not to do things just for our own gratification here. It was genuinely intended to protect her from the thing that happened to her. Could have been worse if she had done something else. So I consider it a valuable lesson but it's not a permanent one. We see individuals who heeded God's message, but not perfectly, at least in the case of Lot. God judged them all ultimately based on the message that they heard and they trusted. So again, when somebody comes at us with a false message, and we start to believe it, or we start to, considering it's okay, it's when you start to embrace it that's the problem there. That's when we start to get ourselves headed down the wrong path. And this passage clearly tells us what's going to happen there. But the other thing to keep in mind, that in this passage, a total of 11 people, 8 with Noah, 3 with Lot, they were never lost in the numbers. How many millions of people were on the world at either time? I don't know. We don't have any idea of the population statistics. Well, we can make some guesses and things like that. But there were a lot more people on the earth in the days of Noah than those 8. There were a lot more people in Sodom and Gomorrah and in that particular area than those 3. And yet, they were never lost in the shuffle. God was able, quite easily, to keep track of them. So, and he dealt with them all based upon the message that they heard and the message that they trusted. So, it's important to consider the messages that we are receiving. Now, if we're being honest about it here, not every message that we're receiving, that we're receiving on a daily basis is morally corrupt or morally degenerate or even morally helpful. I mean, a lot of it's just information. Sometimes it's other things. If you watch any television, you know that if you watch television very much, for every 30 minutes of television that you're watching, you're getting 20 minutes of show and 10 minutes of commercials. What is the purpose of a commercial?
Pay the bills.
Pay the bills on that and try to sell you something, and that's, and this works. This is why this process is what it is because overall that works. So here's laundry detergent. You need some laundry detergent. This brand is good. Here's a car. This particular brand may or may not be good, or in your opinion. Here's other products and things like that. They're just trying to sell you. Sometimes the appeal behind it is a little bit sus. It's all the cool kids are driving this car. All the cool kids are using this detergent. All of the smart people are buying these products. And all of the people who are really special, the ones that the world looks up to, are buying these shoes or what have you. And they can appeal to our vanity or something like that. But in practical terms, it's just messages. We get dozens of those. But there comes a point where you're going to buy that car or one like it because you have the need, and maybe it wasn't all it was cracked up to be or what the commercial said that it was. So, then there's that kind of a situation. Not necessarily fatal, but it can kill you. So, going back to history, you've heard some variation of this quote. Everybody has. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. So can you look in the past here? We have 3 examples here. One of them, we don't have, anything in scriptures where it's concisely summarized for us. But Peter tells us the angels, this happened. The other 2 are straight out of the book of Genesis. You can't even finish the first book of the Bible and not have those things in your mind or be exposed to them. Do you learn the lessons of the past from these things? Kenny?
I was just thinking, because I really appreciate that point. When you look at Matthew 28, Jesus says, all authority has been given to me. He's one person I do not want to argue with. I don't judge, like I have cousins in different religions. I don't judge them. That's God's, responsibility. You look at the example of Noah and the flood, even if now baptism does save us. And I've had someone come to me and tell me that the gospel isn't to be obeyed, and yet I look at Mark 16 and it says, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. And I go on and on for examples, and I don't want to take up any more of your time, but the point just being, it does concern me. I may not judge, but if it's happening in this congregation, it concerns me. And, that's something I think is very plain and simple.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the core problems that we have with a lot of this is the gospel often tells us to do things that we're not really wanting to do. You know, it doesn't have that type of an appeal to it. The gospel should have an appeal to us because this is, this is what we have to follow. This is what we need to understand and practice if we want to go to heaven. Now, you have to believe that there's a heaven. You have to believe that there's a God. There's some other things that come into it. But this is the thing that's going to point us in how to get there.
We ought to be yearning for knowledge in a way that we can serve and do the things that God wants us to do.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not something that we just say, oh, those are the words, and I'll try to remember them, but we ought to be yearning and searching His Word to know that we can go and that we are assured. And it tells us in there that we do what He wants us to do, but it's got to be a yearning within you. Yeah,
it is. And we don't do it alone. You know, we don't ever do this alone. But, you know, if you want to know where your treasure is, look at where you spend your time. That's the most precious commodity that you and I have. I mean, people pay us to spend our time, you know, working for them and that kind of thing. Where our time is spent, that's telling you this is what I want. This is what's important to me. And if that's not heaven, then there's going to be a problem there. That's when the other messages can creep in and have their way, you know, with our soul. And that's, you know, the people who we see in these three examples, they did not make it because they didn't want that message. Wasn't important to them. Didn't believe it. So, any other thoughts or comments? Well, we're done then. We'll pick it up again next week in verse 10. So thank you for your attention and your comments.